You made a comment a few moments ago that I've heard you say before, a death by 1,000 paper cuts. This, I think, goes to the question of circumstantial evidence. And I learned something, of course, a number of things new from you, but this was one thing that surprised me, was about the legitimacy, validity of circumstantial evidence. I remember my mom watching movies or something, and then she said, "Oh, well, that's all circumstantial evidence." And even nowadays, you hear this kind of stuff, this dismissal. Oh, that's just circumstantial, like that, as if it doesn't really count. It makes it look like somebody did something they probably didn't do, and you're just jumping to conclusion based on itty bitty things. But I learned something from you, and embedded in the whole trial procedure that's part of the state of California, related to circumstantial evidence. And this is a big part of how you do your work, or did your work, for now assessing Christianity and making the case for Christianity. So tell us about that.
Well, just keep in mind that all these cases stay open, like the Terry Lynn Hollis case. When I first opened it, it was a lousy case. It's a lame case. They developed over 400 lead cards. It shook our community so desperately that they put a team of 6 detectives on it. 400 leads that went nowhere. The first year I was messing with that case, I just pulled the stuff out and looked at all these boxes. They had just booked all these things into property in boxes. Oh my gosh, what a nightmare. So the cases I get don't have, people say all the time, "Oh, do you have any hard evidence for this?" Because that's not a category of evidence. There's no hard evidence for anything, just as there's no soft evidence for anything. There's only 2 kinds of evidence in criminal trials. There's direct evidence and indirect evidence. Direct evidence is when an eyewitness can tell you that they directly experienced something. So if somebody comes in, and this is the way they use it in trials in California, if someone was to come into the courtroom and say it's raining outside, that would be considered a piece of direct evidence for the veracity of that it's raining outside. If somebody comes in, doesn't say anything to you, but they're covered in water, and they take off their raincoat, they close their umbrella, they stick it in the stand. If somebody follows them in, they got an umbrella, they close it, they get the water off of them. Well, now this is indirect evidence that it's raining outside. So there's 2 forms of evidence we can use to make any case. The eyewitness testimony, and by the way, the glowing rectangle counts as eyewitness testimony. It's just direct evidence, because any eye that can then report something, that's a piece of direct evidence, and the camera eye can do that.
You held up your iPhone when you said glowing.
Yes, yeah, my iPhone. Yes, I know.
So if you're taking a picture or that kind of stuff, yeah,
that's right. That's right. I have my iPhone because it has the latest picture of my granddaughter. I just want to make that selfless plug. Okay. I don't want to start. Okay. So the point is, but the point I'm trying to make is that that's what indirect evidence is: anything other than eyewitness testimony or a video. Or photograph.
What about DNA? That's indirect then.
It's indirect.
By this character.
Fingerprints, indirect. Gunshot residue from hands, indirect. Blood spatter evidence, indirect. DNA, indirect. Now, look, you might say, well, I like the value of this piece over another. Fine. But there's only 2 forms of evidence. Only 2. All I have in my cases is, if there was an eyewitness 30 years ago, I would have solved it 30 years ago. It wouldn't be a cold case. So the cold cases I get are those death by there. So that's why we talk about apologetics, the project, I'm a cumulative case guy, because that's my work. It was all cumulative case. I did work, I was assigned to robbery homicide for 5 years. And during that time, I collected a bunch of other cases that were not this way. The cases you make quickly because you got 4 or 5 eyewitnesses. Those cases are fresh cases, but cold cases are different by nature because they usually don't have the benefit of eyewitnesses. So you build them on circumstantial. The other word for indirect evidence is circumstantial evidence. And that's why there's a jury instruction where judges in every state, our state's no exception, have in California. So if they're talking this way here, they're probably talking much more, conservatively in other places. But the instruction basically is, hey, you're to treat these 2 forms of evidence with the exact same weight, the exact same value. You're not to denigrate one over another.
Yeah.
So we have to teach that. I sometimes think, Greg, and this is why I wrote Forensic Faith, that if we could just teach these principles of evidence, that a lot of this, the skepticism would be revealed for what it really is, which is a condition of the heart. Because you really, once you understand how half the stuff you have to respond to are people who just don't understand how evidence works, that everything counts as evidence. The stuff that's in the crime scene, That counts. The stuff that should be, but it's missing, that counts. What did he say? That's going to count. What did he fail to say? That's going to count too. It's all it's a yin and yang of every possible little, and when we make cold cases, we're looking for all that stuff that has been sitting there all along, but nobody pointed out the fact that he never said this. Or this is missing from the crime scene, so we're having to point that stuff out
and
for
it
a
ought
jury.
to be there. Yeah, this reminds me of when skeptics ask for proof for God, and it's this word that's so equivocal, so ambiguous, and so flexible to them, because unless this is clarified or it's dismissed, like we're not. That's not. I need you to rephrase this. You can give all this good evidence, and they're going to simply say, well, that's not proof. Oh, that's nice, but it's not proof. And of course, their standards for proof are so much higher than they use for any other really important thing in their life. So,
well, this is why we spend a lot of time talking about jury instruction, because, listen, this is true in juries. You guys all the time where people, well, can you prove it to me? Well, I never use that word. I'm not going to prove to you anything. I'm going to give you the evidence and the most reasonable inference from evidence. Now, you may not think that's proof. But that could be because something. This is why we do a voir dire process, where we're asking jurors, like, what might stumble them? What are their biases that might stumble them in this jury? And we get to kick 26, and so does the other side. And we do kick those people off the jury because both sides wants a jury that's going to favor their side.
Yeah.
But what we're looking for people that are passionate and unbiased.
Well, there's a principle here I think that's important to keep in mind, and that when you're talking to people, you're assessing, when you're talking about spiritual things, you're assessing the nature of the conversation, and you're trying to, it's good, as you've just suggested, to anticipate what kind of objection they may come up, where they're going to push back based on their personality, their background, or the kind of skeptic they are, whatever, and then be able to kind of, cut that off at the pass, or speak to it in some way beforehand, or at least be prepared to address that when it comes up. I want to ask another issue. This time's flying by here. It's just so much fun talk. We should have scheduled 2 hours, But nevertheless, people are getting a good sense of the kind of contribution that you have been making for years, Jim. And eyewitness testimony, direct evidence, everything else is indirect. In the case of the New Testament, we actually have both kinds, direct and indirect. However, the eyewitness testimony, let me just put the alleged eyewitness testimony at this point. We'll just talk like
Sure.
We'll tell like the media does. So some guy, you got a video of somebody blowing everybody up. He says the alleged killer. Oh please, So, but it is now in the mind of many people the alleged eyewitnesses. So this is being taken exception with. Oh, they weren't really eyewitnesses. So here you are looking at the. You're looking at the record that we have, the alleged eyewitness testimony, and the testimonies of those who followed. That was your chain of custody. So how do you assess these? This cold case, 2,000 years cold, based on eyewitnesses that are no longer alive for you to, in a certain sense, cross-examine or get more detail or whatever. How does that process work for you with regards to the New Testament document?
Well, and that's often the case for our cold cases. I mean, the guys like in the Terry Lynn Hollis case, a lot of those people are not available to me anymore. People who maybe at one point were even suspects in that case. So yeah, that's, and as a matter of fact, when we finally identified the guy who did this, he had been dead about 15 years. So this is the kind of stuff that happens when you work a cold case. So I always tell people, I don't trust anyone. You know that. I mean, most people who call me for advice, they're calling me for the glass half empty view, right? I mean, ask Danielle. Danielle schedules all the standard reasons, all the reality shows, reality conferences we do. And so Danielle and I have known each other since we were doing youth ministry together. And she will tell you that if she's needs to hear the negative side, she'll just call me, because I'll tell her, this guy's a liar. This guy, just the skeptic in me, right? The pessimism in me is comes out, because that's what's helpful as a detective, is that you have to be distrustful. So I don't trust anybody, but So I don't trust
You
eyewitnesses.
see a murderer under every bush, so we get some kind of criminal under. But see, this I'm glad that you said this, because this is Jay Warner's approach to all of this stuff. He's not. He is a hostile skeptic of everything until he's fully convinced that he can
Right. And I
stand
know that's
solidly on
bad.
the
Okay.
evidence.
It really is bad on this side of the cross, because it's bad that I don't have, like, it's a trust issue, right?
Yeah.
But it served us so well. But people will say, what do you think of this guy? And it's somebody we know. And I'll say, okay, here's what I'm seeing. Okay.
Yeah,
And it's
that's
always
right.
from the skeptical side of things, right? So I have to let go of that. But I will tell you that it does serve you well. If you assume everyone's a liar, someone's eventually going to go to jail. If you assume everyone's a truth teller, no one ever goes to jail. So you have to assume everyone's a liar. And now
And then
people will
be
say,
proved otherwise, and
that's right.
be convinced otherwise.
That's right. And so what happens online is you'll see people will say, well, you can't trust eyewitness testimony, even if they're willing to. But by the way, when they say that, they're granting then that this is eyewitness testimony. So you can't have it both ways. If we're going to say that you can't trust eyewitnesses, well, okay, well, then you've already granted me the premise that they're eyewitnesses. But I'll tell you, I don't trust them. I didn't trust them to start with. I don't think you should trust any. It's true. Eyewitness testimony can be unreliable. That's why we have a test. That's why the jury instructions provide 13 questions, which I list in the book, that you can use to assess eyewitnesses. I don't trust eyewitnesses. You test eyewitnesses. Now, there's also a jury instruction that says if they pass the test, you must trust them. Now, if you can show me where they don't pass the test, fine, that's up to you. And you might say, well, look, I've run these 13 questions in my head. It comes back to those 4 areas that I talk about in the book. So the questions are kind of reworded to kind of capture those 4 notions. Were they really there to see what they said they saw? Have they changed their story over time? Can they be corroborated? Do they possess a bias? So those are the 4 areas. And if they pass the test in those 4 areas, because people will say this all the time, well, I just know this. I just have an intuition about him. When he came on the stand, just the way he said things. Okay, that's not part of the test. Okay,
That's right.
If he passes the test in all the other areas, get over it. Okay, Mr. Sherlock, get over it, because
were you the one
he's got to pass the test.
You don't want to put a photo of an accused defendant that had all these tattoos on his face. It's like,
Right.
was that you? And so and you got to ask the jury, and this is going to influence you, because you look at this guy and say,
no, it's
he's
true.
Guilty.
No, I've had
He's a
cases
bad
where
guy.
this guy's so heavily tattooed that the defense will screen jurors. Now, we aren't going to do that. Honestly, the prosecutors are more than happy to put a box full of jurors that hate these tattoos.
Yeah.
But the defense team's going to stop that. They're going to ask that question. If you can't be fair because of how he looks, because this is so often the case with eyewitnesses. They don't like something about the eyewitness.
Right.
Maybe even a view the eyewitness holds. Maybe it's their politics, that then they therefore can think this guy could say nothing true as a witness, even though this has nothing to do with his political view. This has nothing to do. Well, this is often what happens with the Gospels. They don't like the worldview that's behind the testimony, yet that is not something we allow jurors to consider. They have to consider those strict 4 areas that we talk about in the book. And if they pass the test, and there is no claim of antiquity which passes the test better than this one. So if we're going to have this kind of skepticism about Jesus, you better toss out all of history, because this is the most analyzed, preserved document about an ancient person you can possibly imagine. And I just don't know what more you'd expect given the antiquity of the claims. Nothing does a better job.
So give us a little thumbnail sketch of those tests and how they apply to the Gospels that give you the reason to trust them as bona fide, vertical testimonies.
Some people will say they were there and they saw this thing and they were never even there because they're trying to help out a buddy.
Yeah.
So we have to make sure, number one, were they really there? And the question for me was, is this written early enough to have been written by somebody who was present to see what they said they saw, or at least was written early enough so the people who were there could fact check it? So in other words, if you want to lie about Jesus, it's pretty easy. Wait till everyone is dead. You can say whatever you want because no one's going to be there to say you're a liar. So has it early? So early dating is part of the book. I wanted to know how early could these things be written. Also, I don't expect these to be written immediately. Because I really believe that those first century authors thought that Jesus was going to return in their lifetime. Like there's a sense of urgency. He could return at any moment. And it's not until you see the death of James, the brother of John, which is around 44, that I think you start to see the Gospels emerge. It's kind of like we realize, hey, we're not going to get out of this alive. So our verbal testimony is not going to be enough. We need to write this down. We're going to get killed before this is over, which was in fact the case. So I think there's a reason why they weren't written down early. But here's what I would say to that. I don't know if you've ever gone back and looked at the transcripts for let's say you've probably done tactics a bazillion times, even before you wrote the book.
Yeah.
I know you did the story of reality a bazillion times as credo before you ever wrote the story of reality.
Which, by the way, I'll publicly thank you for convincing me in about 60 seconds that credo as a title for a book really was not marketable, and so we opted for the subtitle, The Story of Reality, and that took me really 45 seconds over dinner there at the Cheesecake Factory, in Thousand Oaks, right? Yeah, and you hammered me. My wife was there with it. I said, okay, well, I changed your name, so now you changed my title. So, okay,
that's
great.
That's right.
Quid pro quo there.
Yeah, we're even. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. But that's the kind of thing that really, I just needed to know. We need to be able to figure out, number one, is this written early enough, and can we trust that it's written early enough? And I don't believe it matters how early that is, in the sense that when you were doing the credo talks, you did them over and over. If I took the transcripts from the last 10 talks you did, you know what I'd find? They're probably not only word for word identical, pretty close, but even if I had the wave files, the inflections, the breaks between, because we do these, we're telling the same story for 10 years. Well, I'll tell you what, if you tell the same story for 30 years, you're even more locked in.
Right.
And so I do believe that those first notions and those first observations about Jesus were spoken very early. You see that in the book of Acts, spoken repeatedly by a group that thought that there's urgency in this, that needed everyone who had ears needed to hear it. And if we were giving our talks that frequently, they would preserve word for word over decades, because mine have. If you look at the way I talk about these topics, it hasn't changed. And you could take the wave files and can lay them down. If I'm doing the same talk now or 15 years ago, it sounds the same. And that's why I have great confidence that they were, number one, I make a case for early dating. And then if that's the case, I think it doesn't really matter when the first book is authored, because I believe that they were immediately ingraining this into memory in a culture that was oral. So I don't have a problem with any of that.
And Jesus did the same thing with his preaching, just like we do. An itinerant preacher, sometimes you get these different accounts, and they may be different summaries of Jesus. What people don't always realize is our doctrine of inspiration is about the writing. It isn't about the original speaking. Now, we're not saying that Jesus wasn't speaking with authority as God then, but what we're focusing in on is the God superintending of the writing and the record. And so you can have different summaries that are still equally inspired by God, but it certainly is likely.
But also, if you know this, look, my collection of files on my computer, if someone says, can you come out and speak about God's crime scene? Well, how much time do you have? 45 minutes. Okay, I've got a 2-hour version, a 45-minute version. I've got a 35-minute version. Yeah. And if you're summarizing that talk, it's going to have less detail than if you heard my 2-hour version of this.
Sure.
So I think we don't know how many times Jesus spoke these same things to different crowds and what's been captured in Scripture either. So I'm pretty comfortable with that. Our friend Frank Turek, we used to do these Fearless Faith conferences together, and I used to tease him because he tells a lot of jokes.
Yeah. And
he would literally tell the same joke at the same point with the same pause, the same inflection. I said, I could do your jokes.
That's right.
And he said to me, he says, Jim, do you think you're any different than me? And I realized, no, I'm not actually. We're all that way. And that's why I'm pretty comfortable with the fact it got transmitted. So that's the first test. How is it early? And I'll make a case for early dating in the book, but that's the first test. Second test is, do we have any corroborative evidence? And remember, corroborative evidence is just touch point evidence. I don't have videos on my cold cases. I don't. They're just too old. So touch point corroboration is, okay, I saw this guy, he ran in the bank, he jumped over the counter, and he yelled at the teller. Okay, where did he jump over the counter? Right there. How did he do it? He used his left hand, he pushed up over the counter. Okay, great. I'm going to print that countertop. His palm print, if it's there, is going to corroborate what this witness just told me about that action. Yet, it's not going to tell me anything about what he looked like or what he said or what he was wearing, because that one piece is just touch point evidence. Now, that's going to corroborate my witness in some way. And if I have more touch point evidence, it'll corroborate that witness even better. And that's what we're looking for. I'm not looking for every detail to be corroborated. That's not the nature of corroborative evidence. Evidence that corroborates is by its nature going to corroborate a small percentage of the overall claim. And we have tons of this from a variety of, I think, 8 different sources I've mentioned in the book, that from archaeology, of course. But again, each one is just going to give you a touch point. Now, here's what I would expect.
Wait, let me jump in and just make an observation, because what you're describing is not just detective work. It's what every person does on a daily basis with all kinds of things they face in their life and all kinds of claims that are made. Any parent knows how this works,
That's right.
because kids leave sometimes more evident paper trail, so to speak, of their behaviors than others. But you're just looking at these little things and you're adding it up and say, oh, I know what happened here. You don't have the full perspective, but you're able to put it together. So this is, we're not encouraging people to do anything unusual here. Just as a detective, you are much better at it. And it's
Well,
with more weight.
it just becomes the pattern of your life, right? So a lot of this touch point corroborate. Here's what I suspect. I suspect a case where someone says something and I can't find anything to corroborate them. For example, there is a 1,000-year history in the Book of Mormon from 600 BC to 400 AD about what happened on the North American continent. Claims about cities, people groups, important leaders, monetary systems, weapon systems, animals that lived, grains that were grown, none of which can be corroborated by the evidence because it didn't happen. So I think part of it is I don't expect 100% of corroboration. But I do expect
something, yeah.
And if I get nothing, I'm suspicious.
Well, then you also have chariots with wheels pulled by horses.
Right.
Neither of those existed in North America before the Spaniards came, and it's whatever. So, in another issue, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, also the claim that these are all people who with Jewish origin who came across the Atlantic at the time of Jeremiah. Okay, there's no Semitic blood in any of the DNA lines on the North American continent. It's all Northeast Asians who came across and became the indigenous people groups.
It's an interesting contrast, yeah, because you use the same kind of tools of assessment in different circumstances, and you come up with rich evidence in one and no evidence in the other.
And I'll just tell you that was part of my journey, Greg, because the only religious people I knew were not Christians. It was my dad's second wife and my half siblings, who were all Mormons. And because I knew that was just demonstrably false, I think it actually kept me away from, people who don't know anything about religion or know anything about Christianity don't know how to separate Mormonism from Christianity. It's all got Jesus in there somewhere, right? Yeah. So I think it really stumbled me for a longer period of time because the only religious people I knew were not, they were Mormons. And some of the claims just were even more fantastical than the claims of Christianity. So that's the second one is, can you corroborate this in some way? The third is, has it changed over time? We talked about that with the chain of custody. And the fourth is, do they possess a bias? And bias always comes down. There's a platform like the Olympics, right? The reasons why people lie are based on motives. And if you're at the Olympics, you got the gold, the silver, and the bronze. Well, the 3 motives for all misbehavior, they stand on a pedestal, like at the Olympics. That pedestal is called pride. Pride is behind every bit of misbehavior. Not pride the way we talk about it in a cultural sense in America, but pride the way that Scripture talks about it. This inclination to serve one's self over anything else. And that's what that's the pedestal they stand on. But they are the pursuit of money, the pursuit of sex, relationships, and the pursuit of power. Those 3 things, which are all designed for good, are what we corrupt and use for evil. These are the things that are behind every lie. And these are also the things that are behind every misstep that a pastor might make. If you wanted to guard yourself as a pastor, those are the 3 areas you have to guard. Right. So they are, they're kind of a cautionary tale. And so I'm looking at the any claim of a witness and asking myself, are they getting something out of it in either money, sex, or relationships or power? Because if they are, then I'm going to be a little more critical. And what I don't see in the Christian narrative, and now Bart Ehrman will say that, and the other skeptics too will say that, yeah, these people were nobodies until they made these wild claims, and then they became somebodies. So it is a power, respect, authority issue. But that's just ridiculous given the fact that Paul was already in that position. He already possessed the authority, power, and respect he used to draw up papers against Christians. So what is he going to jump out with the bigger group, which if you think about the Roman Empire, Jews were in a special category. Others had to bend their knee to the Roman gods. Jews didn't. He had protection in some ways over there. So I'm going to jump out of this group where I lead and get my rear end kicked all over the planet for the next 30 years, hoping in the smaller group to someday return to the position I already have?
No
I
way.
mean, it's possible. It's just not reasonable.
I have a rule about lying. I tell audiences, and I said, all your kids know this, okay? You only lie to get something good. You don't lie to get yourself whipped, stoned, beaten with rods, crucified upside down, or beheaded. That's
right.
That's not a good lie, okay?
Yeah.
Like,
Also,
what was I thinking? You know.
yeah,
Kind of
there's
thing.
this game in youth group we used to play all the time called Two Truths and a Lie. And you could, and I'll tell you, I always noticed this, that you're supposed to tell two truths about yourself and one lie, and we're supposed to guess which one's the lie. Well, no one tells a lie that makes himself look bad usually. Usually the lie is something like, I used to own a Porsche. Because we are so prideful. And, so anyway, the point is, I think this is one of the things you have to evaluate those four things, right? And if they pass the test in those four areas, now that question becomes, what is keeping me out?
Yeah.
This is why that process for me took so long, 9 months. It's not a quick process, but it's a process is worth taking.
I'm glad that God rocked you out and used all these things that you can pass on to other people like me and so many like me in our fraternity, and then so many others that have benefited from your work, Jim.